very kind, very generous to allow us or to give us this opportunity of sharing his keynote speech, which I agreed together to call grand finale due to the time difference between New York and Cairo. Of course, what's the time now where you are, Professor Young?
It's 6:55 in the morning.
6:55. So I mean, please, would like very much to thank you for this. This is more than generous. This is too much kindness, actually. But we have colleagues from different universities all over Egypt, from Cairo University, from Ain Shams University, from private universities, from Hilwan University, from Tanta University, from, I'm not sure if you're familiar with so many names of cities in Egypt that have universities. We have with us also Professor Peter Stockwell from Nottingham University, and we have so many colleagues from MSA University. I want to tell you that we are all very much honored and really honored to host you virtually here. So many people are very much keen to attend this session. This session is very important for us all. You are actually, your presence is, I'm very sorry. Okay. Now, of course, I'll have for the formalities of the conference, only for the formalities of the conference, to introduce and welcome you to this very special session. It's a very special session here that we are hosting virtually, Professor Robert Young, and only for the formalities of the session, I have to briefly introduce our keynote speaker. Of course, he's very, very well known, but I have to do that, although you all know this information that I'll be sharing with you now. Professor Robert Young, he was awarded both his BA and PhD from Oxford. There he was professor of English and critical theory and a fellow of Wadham College. In 2005, he moved to New York City University, where he is Silver Professor, Julius Silver Professor of English and Comparative Literature. From 2015 to 2018, he was Dean of Arts and Humanities at New York University, Abu Dhabi. I have to skip paragraphs here because I want to save you all the time. Professor Young's scholarly works revolve around the radicalization of post-colonialism ever since his first book, White Mythologies, Writing History and the West, 1990, was published. He argues that philosophies of history that had claimed to be world histories are merely histories of the West, seen from a Eurocentric perspective. In Colonial and Desire, 1995, and I'll have to skip so many, but just in 1995, Colonial Desire, in this book, Young examined the history of the concept of hybridity prior to its counter-appropriation and transformation into a cultural political concept by post-colonial theorists in the 1990s. In The Idea of English Ethnicity, 2008, he addresses the contradiction related to the idea of an English ethnicity and the principle of inclusiveness in Britain. Well, we have a not a very long list, but I don't know, countless number of publications by Professor Young, and including selected work, Empire, Colony, Post-Colony, 2015, Frantz Fanon, Alienation and Freedom. Edited works include a very long list here. And I just, to save you time, and to save him time also, because he has been very generous and kind enough to wake up that early. Probably you're an early bird. Please join me to welcome Professor Robert Young, who is honoring us by a talk today entitled Fanon, Post-Humanism and the Environment.
Well, good afternoon, as I believe it is. Let me begin by warmly thanking Professor Sahad Rafa Ibrahim and the MSA University Faculty of Languages for your kind invitation to speak to your conference today on the post-colonial turn, and thank you all for being here. Even if I'm speaking to you, as you heard, very early in the morning from a still dark New York, and actually probably as I speak, you'll see it getting light behind me. But nevertheless, it's a great pleasure to be at least virtually in Cairo today, which is one of my very favorite cities. So I'm disappointed and sorry that I'm not able to be with you in person. So I wanted to begin with a confession, really, which is that for me, the word post-human is not one of my favorite words. And that's why in my title, if you read my title, I bracketed that post prefix in the title of my talk. For better or for worse, I've actually spent much of my life working under the penumbra of various post words, such as post-structuralism or post-colonialism particularly. But post-human and humanism has never really been my thing. And the reason for that is straightforward enough, especially today in the context of the harrowing events that have been playing out in Gaza, just to the northeast of you all. How could anyone imagine identifying as being post-humanist when there's such a crucial, critical, crying need for humanist understanding, sympathy, and love in the face of inhuman cruelty and violence? Of course, I know very well that technically post-humanism as a philosophical stance doesn't negate humanism or the human as such. But for me, the problem is that the word does sound all too much as if it does discard it. That's what post always suggests, as if humanism is over. But for me, there's too much that's precious in humanism that I want to retain. And then there's the fact also that two of my greatest intellectual heroes, whose work I most respect and revere, both identified humanism as their own very central value and dedicated their lives to it. And I'm thinking particularly of Edward Said, who of course spent much of his early life in Cairo and who loved it dearly, and for whom I gave a memorial lecture. In fact, the last time I myself was in Cairo in person. And also Frantz Fanon, about whom I'm going to speak tonight, this afternoon, sorry, whatever time it is there. This morning, I should say, for myself. So Fanon isn't generally associated with Cairo, but in case you didn't know, you might be interested to know that Fanon himself did visit Cairo in March 1960, by which time Said was away at graduate school in Princeton. Fanon visited Cairo in those great days when it was the revered beacon of freedom and political support for all anti-colonial activists, and in some sense much feared by both the French and the British on that account. Although it's very likely that Fanon was concerned with FLN business, the exact reasons why he came to Cairo, or what he did while he was in the city, remain completely unknown to Fanon scholars. So if anyone's interested in archival work or interested in working with me to look for documentation or some traces of Fanon's visit to Cairo so that we might get an idea of why he visited the city, what he did when he was in the city. So if you're interested in following that up, please do get in touch. I would really love to know more. And that's part of my current work on working on a book on Fanon. Excuse me. So it was Fanon who, along with his fellow Martinican Aimé Césaire, who actually very early on made the now common objection to traditional humanism, namely that it was a problematic concept because, as originally conceived and developed, European humanism accorded only a certain section of the peoples of the world with the status of being fully enlightened and fully human. Such was the ideology of race that provided the intellectual foundation and justification of European empires, the critique of which, as you heard, has been really the foundation in my own work from the very first. But this factor, its exclusiveness, wasn't enough for Fanon to then reject humanism, as that generation of French intellectuals who came after him, that is, Althusser, Foucault, etc., did. They were, in fact, less bothered, I think, by its foundation in a kind of racism, but rather they rejected humanism because they saw it as contaminated, on the one hand, by the political of the USSR, which at that time was still professing socialist humanism, and also of the USA, which was also professing humanism and humanistic values, but was engaged in the war in Vietnam. So in fact, for those anti-humanists, it was really the Cold War or Cold War humanism that was their target. And since the Cold War, in that form at least, has now disappeared, so it seems to me that that post-structuralist anti-humanism is itself anachronistic. Whereas Fanon's position, by contrast, has time-traveled, I think, rather well. He simply wanted to redefine humanism as inclusive rather than exclusive, to broaden its scope, to extend to all human beings without exception. And that was what he called his new humanism. Of course, in our own day, as you know, that's still no longer quite enough just to be humanistic in that traditional way, even if you're being inclusive. Although that's that's already a lot, it seems to me, and it's still important. But of course, there is a new issue that emerged in our own century, and that is the problem with traditional humanism in the time of the Anthropocene is not just the unacknowledged racism that Fanon criticized, nor even its unacknowledged masculist or masculine conception of the human that was, in fact, more prone to escape Fanon, or he was less bothered by that, shall we say. But rather, the problem is that humanism, however gendered or non-gendered, by definition, is altogether anthropocentric, as the names or the word suggests, humanism. And it doesn't acknowledge humanity's dependence on and place amongst the other life forms of the planet. So with environmental and eco-critical concerns having been forced on us by the Earth itself as our new global preoccupation of the 21st century, it might seem that Fanon's humanism, or even Said's, of course, Said lived into the 21st century, lived 42 years, longer than Fanon, but both of their humanism potentially has become vulnerable to that very significant reorientation of our contemporary perspectives, which have moved towards multi-species thinking and relativizing, if you like, the idea and the place of the human. So today, what I want to consider with you is really the degree to which Fanon's humanism is vulnerable potentially to that critique of anthropocentrism, or whether he did really think through environmental concerns, even if that wasn't prominent in his own day. Does his humanism envisage or envelop any place for the environment as part of his focus? And what, if any, role does the environment play in his thinking, or does he remain entirely anthropocentric in what now seems a somewhat limiting and indeed unsustainable way? So I want to having said that, really qualify that objection, which is an important revision to that perspective, which is that even the concept of the Anthropocene, which apparently was first invented in the 1980s, but which came into prominence in the early 2000s, has actually already been challenged in itself today on the grounds that it posits the idea that it's been the collective activity of human beings in general that has precipitated the changes in and degradation of the Earth's own ecological system. So the objection against the concept of the Anthropocene is that the term posits a kind of collective responsibility against humanity in general. And although it's certainly the case that all humans are now involved in attempts to assuage its effects, to assuage the climate changes and so forth that we're experiencing, the concept of the Anthropocene as developed by biologists implies that it was humans generally who produced climate change, whereas it's argued, and I think correctly, that in fact the transformation of the Earth's ecology in the last 200 years can't be disassociated from the history of imperialism and, for the most part, its development of the capitalist system, industrialization powered by the use of fossil fuels, the appropriation, devouring of natural resources from colonized countries, etc. In other words, the development of capitalist industrialization is the force that precipitated the Anthropocene, or the changes of the Anthropocene, and those changes can't be disassociated from the history of imperialism and colonialism. So it's not the Anthropocene in general, or the Anthropocene is not humanity in general. It's a particular section of humanity that's produced it. In a recent book called Decolonial Ecology, Thinking from the Caribbean World, Malcolm Ferdinand, it's a translated book, he's French, he argued that our thinking about modernity suffers from what he calls a double fracture, which separates the history of colonization of the world from its environmental history. The strategy of the book involves forcibly linking those two together, since the degradation of the environment forms, he argues, and I think very plausibly, that degradation of the environment forms part of the same history that also makes up the history of slavery, of colonization, and imperialism. And as a counterpoint to that formation, Ferdinand invokes the Caribbean as a site of ecological thinking, that is, Caribbean intellectuals. And to place the Caribbean worldview at the center, which means inserting also the history of slavery and racial colonialism and the Caribbean responses to it, would, he argues, involve an epistemic shift in the conceptualization of the world and the earth at the heart of ecology. In other words, he wants to put the Anthropocene right together with the history of colonialism and imperialism, which he claims are up to his point, thought separately. He claims that, in fact, contemporary decolonial and postcolonial thought, I won't get into the difference between those if there is one, but let's put them together, that they've tended to ignore history's ecological dimensions, that postcolonial and decolonial critics have neglected the question of ecology, while ecological critics, on the other hand, have neglected the history of slavery and colonialism. And his own decolonial ecology, he claims, shatters the environmental framework for understanding the ecological crisis. So I think it's a very important book, though I would say that it actually ignores the significant post-colonial ecological work that actually started in the 1990s, if not before. I'm thinking of people like Graham Huggan, Elizabeth de Loffre, Jennifer Wenzel, Rob Nixon, and so forth. And I won't go into that. I won't rehearse that work now, but just rather, I want to consider one particular aspect of his argument about Caribbean ecology from my perspective as a Fanon scholar who's focused on Fanon's work now for many years, uncountable years. So Ferdinand, I notice, invokes Fanon as a positive contributor to Caribbean ecological thinking during the course of his books, about 12 times. But so my question really is, how far, in his own terms, can Fanon be assimilated to his argument, which seeks to yoke together in a single narrative the history of slavery, racism, colonialism, with the environmental degradation of the planet? Or to put it more simply, was Fanon a decolonial ecologist avant la lettre? One answer that's already available is no. And that comes from Rob Nixon, who in his now very well-known book, Slow Violence, opened the book with a critique of Fanon for sharing the very attitudes that environmentalists critique, particularly with regard to the use of DDT. I'm quoting Nixon here. He says, in 1962, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring jolted a broad international public into an awareness of the protracted, cryptic, and indiscriminate casualties inflicted by DDT. And of course, certainly in the Anglosphere, people think of Rachel Carson's book as really opening, or as the beginning of the whole ecological movement. Yet, just 1 year earlier, says Nixon, Fanon, in the opening pages of The Wretched of the Earth, had comfortably invoked DDT as an affirmative metaphor for anti-colonial violence. More recently, however, Romy Opperman has pointed out that actually Nixon's critique is based on a fundamental misreading of Fanon's text, since, and I'm quoting Opperman here, Fanon's socio-ecological diagnosis of DDT is attuned to the mediation of nature and culture in a colonial milieu. Fanon names DDT in the context of the French colonial government's attitude towards the colonized as a kind of contaminant or disease. So instead of appropriating DDT as a weapon for anti-colonial struggle, Fanon actually complains about it as a kind of pathology of colonialism. The use of DDT expresses a total disregard for the values of the colonized, objectifying them through mechanisms of regulation and extermination that they're sort of assimilated with the perceived pests that the French colonial regime was trying to eliminate. So actually, rather than being, as it were, in collusion with the corruption of the environment, she argues that Fanon's thought actually shows a socio-environmental shift in awareness, which is actually similar to that of Carson. And I think we can substantiate that argument because Fanon's socio-environmental perspective actually correlates directly with his virulent critiques that he was making at the same time of French nuclear testing in the Sahara at sites that remain, in fact, contaminated even today. And that was one of the things that Fanon was inveighing against in the last years of his life. So actually, Fanon was remarkably aware of ecological harm, shall we say, and that I think does mark the provenance of his thought in the Caribbean perspective highlighted by Ferdinand, particularly that to be found in Aimé and Suzanne Césaire's amazing wartime journal, Tropique. And it's not surprising that traces of the perspectives that they develop in Tropique and, of course, in Césaire's early poetry can be found in Fanon's recently published plays written in 1949 that Jean Calfa and I edited in the volume, which was referred to just at the beginning. And his play, The Drowning Eye, for example, invokes images of the vast ecology of the universe indifferent to human beings. So it's actually very post-human in some sense in its perspective. The hero of the play is sort of a hero, I don't know if hero is quite the right word, Francois, more or less stops talking to anyone and communes directly with the stars instead, while also criticizing anthropomorphism of human attitudes towards nature, saying, I quote, people need flowers in order to believe that life is made for them. Things are beautiful between flowers themselves and for themselves, not for humans. It's a remarkable perspective, actually, to advance at that point. At many points in the plays, his language comes close to that of the extraordinary writings of Suzanne Césaire, Césaire's wife, on what she called l'homme plante, or the plant human, as that phrase is translated into English, though it sadly loses the androgyny of the French in that English translation. Ferdinand, while invoking Césaire, strangely ignores the writings of Suzanne Césaire altogether, perhaps because she focuses on gender and nature rather than race and colonialism. But this is one of the things she said. What is a Martinican? A plant human, l'homme plante. Like a plant, Martinicans abandon themselves to the rhythm of universal life. There is not the slightest effort to dominate nature. So that the whole gesture of Tropique altogether, in fact, is to argue that Martinicans have a different relation to nature, which is one of coexistence rather than the domination that the French colonial regime displays. If he ignores Suzanne Césaire, Ferdinand does, however, briefly cite a rather different writer, the remarkable Black Power activist, sociologist, psychologist Nathan Hare, who wrote a historic essay published as early as 1970 called Black Ecology, just 9 years, that is, after Fanon's death. So heavily involved in the politics of the Black Power movement in the United States, Hare specifically alludes to Fanon's work in making an argument which I think structurally resembles Ferdinand's, except that Hare invokes not the Caribbean, but the American Black. And he says, this is written 53 years ago, the emergence of the concept of ecology is potentially of momentous relevance to the ultimate liberation of Black people. Yet Blacks and their environmental interests have been so blatantly omitted that Blacks and the ecological movement currently stand in contradiction with each other. His argument is that the Black condition, that's the Black condition in the United States, of course, is fundamentally shaped not just by racism and the history of slavery, but by all the conditions that subsequently resulted from those institutions. The result is that the conditions of life in the ghetto operate in an environment that's still unhealthy physically and psychologically. So his argument is actually that the Black problem, so-called, as defined often in the popular press in the 1960s in the United States, is actually fundamentally an environmental one. So the social problem, if you like, as it was seen, or problem of race, or problem of minority groups, was actually fundamentally environmental. So what comes across strongly in reading Hare's argument, to me anyway, is the degree to which at that time environmental degradation was thought of in essentially still local terms, not yet in our terms of the planetary conditions that now affect everyone. And you can see you can see why that is. It was thought in terms of specific sites of pollution and environmental degradation to which particular people had been subjected, not a question that needs to be considered in terms of its global impact from which no one escapes and which affects the whole future of humanity in general. And to some extent, this remains the case in discussions of Black ecology and even sometimes in the use of the term environmental justice. But the important point is that the broad perspective of the Anthropocene masks the extent to which environmental degradation, physical and social, has particularly affected people of color, non-white people, who typically have not been the people who were responsible for that environmental degradation. So that differentiated local focus is very much of its time, and it's you might say just the beginning of the environmental movement that has extended, unfortunately, in our own day to a global one. But it forms also the basis of an argument that Fanon made in his second published essay of February 1952, which in English is called the North African Syndrome. And there he's talking in that essay, he's talking about the health issues of North African migrants in Lyon, who typically came from Algeria or Morocco. And those health issues were dismissed by the local French doctors, typically as fake or imaginary. And as a result, they jokingly created a condition which they named the North African syndrome among themselves, which meant, in effect, a totally imaginary illness. Fanon argues against that and says, in fact, their illnesses are the product of the unhealthy and alienating slum conditions in which immigrants live. And this is, of course, something that we can think about as still relevant, very much so, to our own day. He argues that the French doctors' reactions were essentially racist, one where their exclusive focus on the body outside its living environment means that they're unable to perceive the extent to which the physical environment of Arab migrants is the cause of their poor physical and psychic health. These are completely interrelated. And actually, for Fanon, the environment would always be fundamental to his analysis and critique of the conditions of Black people or immigrant peoples who live in predominantly white or colonized societies. You could even, I think, describe him in some sense as an environmental humanist. But what did he mean exactly by environment? And what did he mean by the term he used to describe the effect of the environment on mental health, which was sociogeny? Today, people are probably more familiar with that term sociogeny from Sylvia Wynter's reading of Fanon than from Fanon himself. She takes it from his book, his first book, Black Skin, White Mask, Peau Noire, where he introduced the term sociogeny for the first time. Wynter appears not to have read any of Fanon's other extensive medical psychiatric writings or his late public lectures given in Tunis on the meeting between psychiatry and society, which indicates, again, his social perspective on psychiatry. And even before Fanon's transformative internship with the radical Catalan psychiatrist François Toscaès at Saint-Ambon in 1952-3, his account of his then still minimal psychiatric practice that he offers in Black Skin, Fanon wrote the book, he finished the book Black Skin, White Mask before he'd actually fully qualified as a doctor. So all his use in vocation and so forth of psychoanalysis or psychiatry and so forth was that still of a medical student who hadn't actually really practiced in his own right up to that point. But all his accounts of that practice that he'd had so far shows that sociogeny, or the centrality of environmental issues in any account of mental health, provided the basis both for his therapeutic method and his early preoccupation with critiquing, in fact, psychoanalysis, because he said psychoanalysis simply focuses on very much just on the individual alone, or the individual and their immediate family, as in Freud. But he wanted to move beyond that to the larger environment in which people lived. And he was initially inspired to do that by the pre-war writings of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, who was just, as it were, making his name at that time, and the German Gestalt therapist Kurt Goldstein, who both argued that Freud's preoccupation with the continuing influence of parents in childhood ignored the wider family conditions under which ordinary people grew up and then lived. And Fanon extended that to include not only the wider family, but also his patients' social and physical environments much more broadly. And that became the foundation of his radical critique of psychoanalysis altogether. There's a lovely episode, a very telling episode in Black Skin, where, as happens from time to time in the book, Fanon sometimes imagines himself in the position of a particular kind of analyst. He sort of imagines himself, a Freudian, imagines himself using a particular perspective. And then, having done that, he then tells us what he would have done instead. And one example comes when towards the end of the book, when he's discussing the Austrian-American psychotherapist Alfred Adler, who's known as the founder of the individualist school of psychology, whose ideas, in fact, on aggression and the inferiority complex have been very productive for Fanon. But Fanon concludes that section by imagining himself practicing as if he were an Adlerian. And he takes issue with him on that basis for encouraging his patients to adjust to society rather than challenging it. And here he assimilates his position to that of the French colonial ethno-psychoanalyst Octave Manoni, who'd argued that the Malagasy people of the French colony of Madagascar had what Manoni called a Caliban complex. That is, he claimed they had a complex which showed the need of the intervention of a white colonial French Prospero to save them. Manoni was actually quite progressive in his views, but not in this overall complex that he produces for the Malagasy people. Fanon, perhaps predictably, didn't agree with him, and here offers his imagined response to the dream of a black patient who he's treating, who had had a dream in which he dreamed that he was white. This is Fanon. If I were an Adlerian, once I'd established that my counterpart in his dream had fulfilled his desire to be white, I'd demonstrate to him that his neurosis, his psychic instability, and the crack in his ego stem from this governing fiction of wanting to be white. And I'd say to him, Monsieur Manoni has fully described this phenomenon in the Malagasy. You should, I believe, accept everything that you have to around you and remain in the place assigned to you in society. But then Fanon suddenly stops and dramatically turns from his patient to address the reader directly, offering a very different analysis, which makes clear his disagreement with Adler and far more Manoni. And the book is full of these dramatic turns, and it's very obvious that Fanon actually moved from writing plays, thinking in terms of drama, to writing Black Skin, White Masks. So he turns and says, no, well, I won't say that. I tell him it's the environment, it's society that's responsible for your mystification. Once that's been said, the rest will follow of its own accord, and we know what that means. The end of the world, by Jove. And in that last line, the end of the world, he's I think first of all quoting a line from Aimé Césaire, but Césaire is himself invoking the fourth line of the Internationale, c'est l'éruption de la fin. It's the explosion of the end. In other words, he's directly linking the patient's illness to his class position and his social position in terms of, you might say, actually, history of colonialism and capitalism. His solution, in other words, is revolutionary, change the world. So the environment for Fanon means the social environment in which racism forms part of a broader system of exploitation, inequity, and injustice. And his own treatment for his patients, particularly his colonized patients, or patients who are colonized, is to make them aware of the real social basis of the problem, which of course is not very psychoanalytic. He says, I quote, my objective will be to enable my patient to choose action with respect to the real source of the conflict, i.e. the social structure. In the situation of colonial violence, he concludes a few pages later, I quote, the discoveries of Freud are of no use to us whatsoever. So Fanon's psychiatry, his version of psychoanalysis, insofar as he was employing psychoanalysis, is radically different from any Freudian model. And it was in Algeria, where he went in 1953, 54, that Fanon extended his understanding of the social structure, which operates according to an ideology and practice of racism, to a broader global view that comes close to the materialist decolonial perspectives of today. In other words, he thought that the social inequities under which Algerian patients lived were the direct product of the violence of colonial rule. The degradations to which Algerians were subject in the Manichaean divisions of the colonial city are at once social and environmental. So colonialism is not an arbitrary system. It's designed, in fact, to enable extractive capitalism, as we might, extractive racial capitalism, as sometimes people prefer. This is Fanon. The wealth of the imperialist nations is also our wealth. In concrete terms, Europe has been bloated out of all proportions by the gold and raw materials from such colonial countries as Latin America, China, and Africa. Today, Europe's tower of opulence faces these continents, for centuries the point of departure of their shipments of diamonds, oil, silk, and cotton, timber, and exotic produce to this very same Europe. And then he concludes with his famous statement, Europe is literally the creation of the third world. So it's the creation of the third world, but what people don't often really emphasize in that famous statement is that it's actually it is the creation because of commodity extraction, because of capitalist industrial exploitation. Despite his emphasis on extraction of commodities, Fanon doesn't emphasize the environmental destruction that the industrialized extraction of commodities involves. His focus here obviously falls on colonialism's economic basis, less the environmental degradation that it produces. And that is very much more the perspective of his own time. It's similar, for example, to Gramsci's observation in his famous essay, The Sudden Question of 1926, that, and I quote Gramsci, in this way, the colonial populations become the foundation of which the whole edifice of capitalist excuse me, exploitation is erected. These populations are required to donate the whole of their lives to the development of industrial civilization. For this, they can expect no benefit in return. Indeed, they see their own countries despoiled of their natural resources. Gramsci is talking there about what in his day wasn't even yet called the Third World, but he's talking about colonized countries. But he's also pointing to the fact that the south of Italy was subject to the same conditions. So the colonial fracture, if you like, was not exclusively directed towards colonized countries, but also to the subjugated parts of richer countries, such as the south of Italy. So despite that emphasis on extraction rather than degradation, that's part of the same history as we now think. And it's on that basis that I'd argue that Fanon can in fact be read as a very early advocate of environmental justice, particularly for people from the global south, excuse me, in the face of repeated situational ecological disparities of the kind evoked quite frequently in his work, most famously the account that I'm sure you all know of the opening at the opening of The Wretched of the Earth, of the segregated colonial cities, divided between two species, as he puts it, of humans, regarded as two species, that is, who dwell respectively in light and darkness, cleanliness and stench. He says, the colonized world is a world divided in two. The colonists sector, the French sector, is a sector built to last, all stone and steel. It's a sector of light and paved roads. The colonized sector, or at least the native quarters, the shanty town, the Medina, the reservation, is a disreputable place inhabited by allegedly disreputable people. You're born anywhere, anyhow. You die anywhere from anything. It's a world with no space. People are piled on one on top of the other. The shacks squeezed tightly together. The colonized sector is a famished sector, hungry for bread, meat, shoes, coal, and light. The colonized sector is a sector that crouches and cowers, a sector on its knees. So as in the North African syndrome, Fanon's focus falls on the degraded habitation and environment of colonized people, a degraded environment produced not by themselves, of course, but by the ethos, the practices of the colonial regime. Fanon's focus remains on the social, cultural, and individual and psychic degradations of colonialism, rather than maybe today, where we also add in the cost to the living earth itself, the earth itself as a form of sentient being. So that's the perspective that is not there in Fanon, but which is certainly compatible with his whole perspective about environmental justice. So the human degradation with which he's concerned is also, I just want to end by emphasizing, it's very much focused on the present. And one significant difference between Fanon's position and Ferdinand's today is their attitudes towards history. So Ferdinand wants to bring two fractured histories together for an understanding of our present situation, and I think he's correct in that sense, but maybe overstates it in certain domains. For example, although his emphasis on European colonialism is certainly justified, it allows him to ignore other forms of colonialism of the past and the present, Japanese, Russian, Chinese, Indian, for example, whose effect on the well-being of our contemporary planetary environment can hardly be ignored. It can't, as it were, the division he makes tends to suggest that only a certain group now responsible, now have some sort of mandate to do something. At this point, it's not just up to the former Western powers to save the planet, even if they should certainly take a major share in doing it. We could adapt Fanon's argument that the colonial powers should pay reparations to the colonized countries. They must pay up, he said. He thought they should pay reparations for colonization in general. And we could adapt that to the contemporary demand that it's the industrialized countries and all industrialized countries that should pay for the costs relating to tempering and assuaging climate change. A substantial part of Reche de Diet is also concerned to critique the new black neocolonial regimes in Africa. And Fanon, interestingly, doesn't simply blame Western imperialism tout court for the present state of things, as Ferdinand does. And while decolonization was obviously central for him, his commitment to it arose because he was determined to change the present situation in which he and his patients lived. And what's distinctive, I think, about Fanon, very distinctive, and seems more so today, perhaps, is that he always thought towards the future, and that future orientation always formed the basis of his psychiatry. He refused to be burdened with the past. For example, the history of slavery. That's what decolonial meant for him. This is what he says. Disalienation will be for those whites and blacks who've refused to let themselves be locked in the substantialized tower of the past. For many other black men, disalienation will come from refusing to consider their reality as definitive. I'm a man, I have to rework the world past from its very beginning. I'm not myself alone for the slave revolt in Saint-Domingue. Which of course is Haiti. So he refuses to be bound by the past because he's always sees that he doesn't want to harp on the past. He wants to actually move into the future from the present. And I think nothing separates our perspective today more from Fanon than his optimistic orientation towards a socialist future. It really shows the distinctive difference between his time and our time, facing, or rather already in the midst of undergoing an apocalyptic environmental catastrophe today. What seems to be the case is that we no longer believe in the future, and we've turned to blaming the past. Whereas Fanon's desire was to extract the human condition right out of that murky past and the degraded present that history produced towards a better future. And in that context, we can say that if Fanon had lived longer than the 36 years of his short life, he would certainly, I think, very much have become more concerned with one aspect of the environment that he doesn't emphasize, namely the broad material destruction that is affecting the whole world's population, not just particular sites of habitation. And we could be confident in making this claim, both because the degrading effects of environment formed the basis really of all his work, and because he was always looking towards and thinking about the future, as I've suggested, which would now include our planetary future, and he would be thinking about the means to transform it. Fanon died a decade before the disastrous application of the persistent toxic chemical chlordicone began in Martinique and Guadeloupe. Chlordicone has devastated the soil of the islands after being applied to protect the banana plantations from pests. And it was applied, in fact, even after it was established that it was a toxic chemical. But so Fanon lived before that awful time. But he was also well aware of the toxicity in general resulting from violent forms of domination. And for him, that violence required a response of a reciprocating violence to expel it, whose effect would precisely be disintoxication. In fact, his whole politics and ethos were centered around the removal of poison, which he thought of as colonial poison. He thought of that violence, the violence of colonialism, in environmental terms as a poison. And his famous line, often quoted, where he says violence is a cleansing force, what he actually wrote in French was la violence désintoxique. The violence is a disintoxicating force, which is rather different. Of course, cleansing is not wrong, but it's not exactly, it doesn't get the focus of Fanon's precise point. His whole ethos was about removing, purging some form of cathartic purgation of the poisonous effects of the environment, wherever that poison came from, on the individual and society. And that would always lie at the center of his passionate project for a humanized world of environmental justice, especially and above all, those living in the global south. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Young, for such an intriguing, interesting, illuminating, and I think very engaging. Can you hear me? Or did you? Yeah, okay. Is it better now? Yeah, I was just using, I was just describing, I mean, I was just telling you that people were extremely, I can sit among the audience. I don't know if you can see their eyes, if you can make eye contact, but I was making eye contact on your behalf.
Thank you.
And I think that everyone was extremely interested. This is a very intriguing talk. And I think that so many people, I could see also not only their eyes, but I could see also question marks coming up from their heads here. So I just wonder if you allow us more time for responding to the audience questions, if you don't mind.
Of course, yes, no problem.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much. So I'll give the microphone to yes, Professor Safa.
Hello, Professor Young. Thank you very much for your interesting and informative session. My name is Safa Ahmed. I'm a professor of interpreting and translation in MSI University. In 1990, George W. Bush said that we are in front of a new world order. And as a post-colonialist myself, working in the field of post-colonialism and translation, it seemed that the movement of post-colonialism needs or is getting harsher now, and we are in front of new kind of colonialism, which I call neo-colonialism. Do you think there is a prospect for decolonialization in our world now? And if possible, how? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. That's a big question. I think one of the objections to the term postcolonialism that was made whenever in the past anyway was that colonialism was not over, by which people meant not colonialism in its formal sense of sovereign or non-sovereign states, but definitely past global power structures, shall we say. And clearly, it would never be the case that global power structures would not continue to operate. That's not, unfortunately, how human societies work. So what we have today is obviously a different reconfiguration of power structures that seem, in certain ways, if you like, at least as harmful as colonial rule. In some sense, you might say more harmful. The other thing that's going on, though, is that something you mentioned, the word decolonial, which is about something rather different, which is what Ngugi wa Thiong'o actually many years ago called the decolonization of the mind. In other words, the attempt for people to rethink all forms of knowledge, really, all forms of experience and understanding in ways that don't necessarily assume Western epistemologies, Western perspectives, trying to integrate other forms of knowledge that previously had been devalued. Now, that's something that every individual can do for themselves. So that's something in which we can all intervene, certainly much more easily than in global power structures of sovereign states as they war and pursue their fractious relations, which one often feels, I do anyway, you know, the distressing thing about that is the impotence that individual people feel as these wars and forms of violence repeat and continue. But at the decolonial level, and maybe at some point, this will really affect how people think more broadly, and it can do certainly no harm and potentially a lot of good, is looking to oneself, starting with oneself, and thinking through all the perspectives that we have, and becoming more open to other perspectives, other forms of knowledge, and so forth. Obviously, in Egypt, that's a very different scenario from the United States, where I am, where, as you can see behind me, day has now dawned. Everybody, you know, it's not a thing everybody will do in the same way. It's very place situated, very culture situated, but it's an important intervention that everybody can make, and the positive thing about that is it's inclusive rather than exclusive. So it's something we can all do and all think about, just as the whole concept of environmental justice and environmental politics starts again with the individual, even if it goes up to the level of the global. And some anti-colonialists, I think Fanon, for example, and also Gandhi in India, also made that argument that decolonization, as it was, or as it needed to be in their day, was not simply something that operated at the level of the state or larger power structures. It was actually something that begins with the individual. That's that very last quote I mentioned, I gave from Fanon, begins at the level of the individual, au niveau des individus. The individual level, violence is a disintoxicating force. So I think we need to disintoxicate ourselves, if you like, according to Fanon's prescription. In other words, to think of what poisons exist not only in our bodies but also our minds, and to be open to other forms of reparative and restorative care.
Good morning, Professor Young. This is Mona Namouri from Tonsa University. It's such an honor to have you with us today. And I feel like I need to go somewhere with a cup of coffee and try to digest it all, because it has been such a heavy lecture. My question is, and it's quite simple. I know that to create a post-colonial situation, there are so many factors that result in a post-colonial situation. But if we, would it be too optimistic to think that if we decrease illiteracy, eventually eradicating illiteracy, the situation will change? I mean, I think that illiteracy contributed a lot to create that post-colonial situation, that miserable, environmentally miserable and socially and politically miserable situation. If we, all the enlightened people in the world, work together to eradicate literacy, will it really result in changing that situation? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. Certainly, I'm, if you like, enough of a traditional liberal to believe in education and therefore literacy, and that the original political program of liberalism right back in the 18th century was to focus on education for everybody and give everybody the chance to have access to education, which inevitably involves, of course, literacy, reading and writing. And I think many people in the Western world have lost that focus, because education is relatively available, certainly, and compared to some other countries. I think literacy is important for any form of self-formation, for any self-awareness, though I'm not somebody who believes that you can't be intelligent if you're not literate. There's many forms of intelligence that people have access to. But I certainly believe in the need for literacy and the degree to which that gives people access to knowledge and information, and therefore self-awareness, from which they can make intelligent decisions. I don't think, nevertheless, on the other hand, that literacy all necessarily produces intelligent decisions. There are also, obviously, unfortunately, examples where literate people make very unintelligent decisions, politically and otherwise. But that doesn't mean to say that it shouldn't be an end and definitely a social good for everybody to have that access. Because one of the things that obviously is happening in the world today is that literacy in different forms is simply more and more required. That in order to survive as a human being, offering your labor in a traditional sense is less and less effective, if you like, for survival, and therefore people need forms of literacy, both for their own self-awareness and their own personal development, but they need forms of literacy to survive, physically to survive, materially to survive. And so, yes, it's important, can't be understated. I'd certainly agree with you there.
Good morning, Professor Young. Thank you very much. My name is Mustafa Riyad. I'm a professor of English literature at Ain Shams University and MSA. Thank you very much for your rich, profound, and illuminating talk. And my question is about what you might think of what's happening in certain areas of the West by way of green movements, clean energy. Is there hope? I'd like to think that there is hope for the sake of my children and grandchildren. I hate to think of a bleak future. So perhaps if we come together, I mean, we decolonize the colonized world and join hands with green movements in places like Germany and elsewhere. Now, what are the prospects from your perspective? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I completely agree with you. I have children myself, so particularly anyone with children is thinks about the future in a way that they can understand from Fanon. That thinking about the future rather than dwelling on the past is so important for all of us, I think. It relates to my answer to an earlier question, which is yes, we all have individual responsibility in so many different ways, but obviously the environment is a key one there, and we make decisions every day that affect our larger environment. So it's not something that we should just consider that somebody else should do something about. But of course, the big issue is whether at the macro level, let's say internationally, enough can be done to change our attitudes to the environment, and that's something I find it harder to be over optimistic about, even though there are incremental moves in that direction. And it's something that the world is not really set up effectively to deal with, because, as you know, most of our decisions are made at the national level. There are international agreements and so forth, but we all know how difficult that they are to bring about, and then also to actually enforce, should we say. So it's something that's being pushed on us, and I think the more individuals focus on green issues, then the more governments feel that pressure, and then the more willing they will be to negotiate with other governments for really major changes at their level. But it's also about, as you know, about our own expectations, our own needs, our own forms of consumption in particular, which operate in so many different levels. And yeah, we must all do something. We must all keep that at the forefront of what we do. And it's you might say it's a minor thing, but it's nevertheless a significant thing. I think that within universities, more and more academic subjects are taking on board issues of the environment and the need for green thinking, green politics. So it's extending, it's infiltrating, if you like, into so many different disciplines now, and that awareness and those forms of thinking are really key in transforming the way that human beings on the planet operate, everywhere. But nevertheless, I would go back to the point I was trying to make in the talk, which is that the degradation of the world's environment that everybody is experiencing isn't just a thing that is attributable to humanity in general. It's actually attributable to industrialization, and however all the different ways in which industrialization has been developed, and therefore it does seem to me those countries that are most industrialized should bear most responsibility for doing anything that we can, and in particular reducing consumption and reducing toxicity and so on and so forth. So we've got to put it in some historical perspective. It's not just come out of human beings living and breathing. It's actually come out of a particular process that can be charted historically in relation to the use of fossil fuels and so forth, and that the big consumers and so forth, the big industrial plants, countries and so forth, these are operating from specific places, and the people who the institutions, the companies and so forth that are responsible, really the work for the future needs to start there, not just in general. But that doesn't mean to say that each of us can't can't make our own contribution, and that's certainly important.
Professor Young, I don't know where I should be looking. Okay. You've been extremely generous in answering very general. My name is Lubna Youssef, and I teach at Cairo University. I can't but talk to you, and so I'm sorry. I'll just talk to you. لا مش مسألة. ده حاجة. This is comic relief, but the question has nothing to do with comic relief because look here. All right. Well, I'm a good girl. I listen. You've been very generous in answering very general questions. And I think we need to really sit and read your lecture because it deals with so much, all right? But I'm going to jump on the word degradation that you've used. And I would like to link it with an even more general question that has to do with decolonization, all right? You live very close to Washington, D.C., and so you live very close to those whose minds need to be decolonized, all right? I know you're talking to Egyptians, but I would like you to tell Egyptians what you think, those living in Washington, D.C. The internet is not available now.
No, it's not responding, of course.
The internet is angry. I would like you to tell us Egyptians what you think those living in DC need to read because they need their minds to be decolonized, all right? Maybe when you tell us, we're going to be able to speak in a louder voice with suggestions, all right, that might help us in helping them to decolonize their minds.
I think you frozen, or you kept freezing. So actually, for better or for worse, I missed quite a lot of what you were saying. I'm tell anybody in Washington D.C. what to read, but I do think one thing that we all should read and think about is relates to the thinking that I was trying to foreground of Suzanne Césaire, which is not only to think about other animals, which of course there's a lot of work now thinking about multi-species and so forth, but my think about the fact that human beings and indeed all animals are completely dependent on plants, and yet plants, vegetation is typically disregarded in the way that we not only think about the world in general, but also epistemologically in the sense of how does a plant think, if you like, because in some sense I feel that really to understand and to be truly green, you need to try thinking like a plant and to resituate yourself out of the animal sphere and animal kingdom altogether, to think about how plants operate, how they grow, and why how they grow well or not, as a way for reorienting ourselves into thinking about the earth as an ecosystem. And as long as we stick within our animal minds, we won't really understand the ecology of the earth. So I would recommend that not only to anybody in Washington DC, but to anybody anywhere, as a fundamental necessity really for becoming truly green. So that's rather a general question, a general answer to your big general question, but nevertheless, it's an important one. And thinking about the life of plants and how plants live, and how plants think, if they do think. Some people now think that plants do think in certain ways and communicate. In fact, that profound reorientation is something that we need to do in order to understand the earth on which we live. We've just disregarded it for far too long, I think.
Okay.
Should I be looking here?
Okay. One final question.
Good morning, Dr.
Are you
Young.
we need 2 questions. Can you take 2 more questions, Professor Young?
Two more, and then I will need my morning cup of coffee. Right.
Okay.
Good
So
morning,
okay, we
Dr.
have 10 minutes.
Good morning, Dr. Young. My name is Mahmoud Khalifa. I'm an assistant professor at the Faculty of Al Alsun Hurghada. And speaking of post-colonialism, I'm interested in this idea of settler colonialism. How do we apply post-colonialism to active colonialism? For example, in Palestine. So does it apply? How post-colonial is post-colonialism? That's
Thank you. Yeah, very important question. One of the significant developments, I would say, within post-colonial thinking, if one can put it up as that sort of framework, is the move towards thinking about different forms of colonialism, and particularly distinguishing between colonialism, which was imposed from, obviously all colonialism is imposed from the outside in some sense, but where the colony was what's called an exploitation colony primarily, or a resource colony, or the kind of colonialism under which Egypt suffered, where because of power structures, because of communication structures, and so on and so forth, the French and then the British intervened by force as colonial powers. But then, as you know very well, they were forced to leave. So they left, and of course that leaves a trace. No form of colonization sort of disappears entirely, but nevertheless, people at least have the sovereignty restored to them, and that's traditional colonization, you might say, or the simplest form. And I guess much colonization took that form. Fanon was dealing with something that was different. There wasn't a special phrase for it in his day, but which we now call settler colonialism, because what the difference between Algeria and most other African colonies in particular was the existence of a large settler population. And it makes sense to think about colonization in relation to that single issue, because in general, if we think about the Americas, for example, Australia, New Zealand, and so on and so forth, there are places around the world where the people living there are predominantly, in fact, in origin anyway, settler colonials. What was different about the Algerian revolution was that the Algerians managed to restore sovereignty to the indigenous people, although of course who's indigenous in Algeria is a slightly complicated question, as you know, with different groups, but let's simplify it and talk about Algerians versus the French. So it's particularly difficult to decolonize a settler colonial country, because the settlers typically are still there. They were born there very often. They've been there for generations. They feel it's their country, understandably, and so forth. The Algerian War probably the most bitter, certainly the most violent of all decolonial wars or anti-colonial wars. And it was for that reason, because it wasn't just, they weren't just fighting the French army in general, in the way that, say, the Egyptians were fighting the British and subsequently French armies, but they were fighting the people who were living in Algeria, who were classified as French, but were in fact settlers. Though many settlers in Algeria were not really French; they came from all over the place. That's a minor detail. So it was unusual that the Algerian indigenous population managed to achieve sovereignty at the end of that war. And of course, as we know, a lot of the majority of the settlers actually left and went to France, even if many of them didn't even originally, or their families didn't even originally come from France. There was also the complication of the Jewish population of Algeria, which was there after, as a result of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain with the Reconquista in the end of the 15th century. And typically, the Jews of Algeria moved either back to France or to the newly established state of Israel. So, but typically in revolutions against settler colonial societies, the settlers don't leave. And that's what makes the difference between the Americas, where the Americas achieved independence before the colonization of Africa, for example, because they achieved, by about 1815, almost the whole of the Americas were independent, with a few exceptions, the Caribbean and so forth. But the people who achieved independence were the settlers, not the indigenous people. And typically, it's only today, really, that indigenous people have been able to start reasserting themselves politically. And so it's a particularly difficult problem, because these two groups are going to continue to need to live together. Many people have argued that Israel is a settler colonial state, although Israelis typically dispute that very virulently. Obviously, there's a history to Israel and so forth, which you're all well aware of, and
What went wrong? Last 5 minutes.